What happened? And the answer is Christianity happened. The figure who was dying on that cross, it turns out he was God, which is the most radical upending of everybody's assumptions about what glory is. God, the fittest, was sacrificed for we the weakest, so that we the weakest might survive and thrive and pass on a compassion revolution. That's the utter upending of our natural assumptions.
Welcome to the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast, where we help you experience and bring renewal to your mission field. Join us and receive free resources at innovativechurchleaders.org. On today's episode of the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast, we have Glen Scrivener. How are you doing, Glen?
I'm doing really well. Thank you, Eric.
Well, I've been following you for years. Your ministry of speaking life in a place like the UK has been so inspiring, especially for me here in Austin, which we have more in common with the UK than we do Dallas. You know, we're trying to reach people who didn't grow up with faith. Their parents may have even been the ones that walked away, perhaps grandparents. There are things that are happening, though, in the UK that I think could be really encouraging. I'd love to just hear kind of the state of the church in the UK and what you're experiencing over there right now.
They've just released a report called The Quiet Revival in April of this year. The Bible Society got together with a very respected polling company called YouGov that do polling for the nation, for the government, for corporations. But they polled about 19,000 people back in 2018, and they polled 13,000 people in 2024. They asked them the same questions about church-going habits, also about various measures of well-being. And the headline statistics are that there were about 8% of the UK was self-reporting as going to church at least monthly back in 2018. And that went up to 12% in 2024. Now that's going up from quite a low base. It's also a measurement of self-report, and it's also about monthly church going. But with all those caveats, it was nice to see church going on the increase. It was certainly something that challenges the secularization thesis that I think a lot of people have lived by, that as GDP goes up, so church attendance must go down. I think there are a lot of sociologists that have lived with that picture of the world in their head. And all of a sudden, we've got a growing church. And then the section of the UK population that is now most interested in faith are younger people and younger men. So the figures for the 18 to 24-year-old men went from about 4% saying they go to church monthly in 2018 to 21% in 2024 saying that they go to church at least monthly. I don't think we are yet seeing that level of church going among young men. We're certainly seeing an openness to faith. We're certainly seeing people who are far more willing to say they go to church. And now the big goal for evangelists like me is to challenge such young men who told the pollster that they do go to church to actually show up on a Sunday.
That's a great point. I would love to hear from your perspective as an evangelist, as someone who's been tilling the soil, so to speak, for years. What do you think has led to some of these more positive signs of interest and openness?
I think people are interested in and open to many, many things. Some of them are good for them spiritually, and some of them are very bad for them spiritually. And so I think we are at a time and a place where the secular story has gotten old and threadbare, and the idea that liberal democracies are just going to win the day and it's basically the end of history and we are going to blast off into a progressive utopia. All we need to do is just sort of hit the equality button a little bit more, and we're basically in the New Jerusalem. I think that story of the world becoming increasingly progressive and liberal and just better is, well, it's just taken so many hits. And you think about some of these, if you think about a young man who's 24 years old, what have they lived through? They've lived through 9/11. They've lived through the 9/11 wars. They've lived through a global financial crisis. They have lived through smartphones absolutely, wrecking our attention spans and our abilities to socialize with one another. They have lived through like so many crises. They've lived through a war on the continent of Europe. They're living through a major war in the Middle East right now. And so the myth that things are going to get better if only we use the Be Kind hashtag just a little bit more, that myth is gone. I think also the presence of church scandals in the popular imagination has kind of been replaced by the acknowledgement that every part of society is equally capable of doing great evil. I think of, when did Spotlight come out as that, Oscar-winning film that was
Hmm.
talking about the Archdiocese of Boston and some horrendous child sexual abuse happening in that part of the world. But I think in the popular imagination for people who are my age, I'm in my mid-40s, when you hear abuse scandal, you probably put the word church in front of abuse scandal and you think of a church abuse scandal. I think a 24-year-old guy who's showing up in our churches doesn't think church abuse scandal because the BBC has had some absolutely appalling scandals. The royal family has had some appalling scandals. You've got your Harvey Weinsteins and you've got your Jeffrey Epsteins and schools and scouts and sporting clubs as likely to be associated with sexual abuse, tragically, as churches have been in the popular imagination. And so the idea that the church is uniquely the bad guys, I think that sense is gone among younger Gen Z type people. And so people then are thinking, what is the story of the world that's going to give me a sense of purpose in the midst of a meaning crisis? And they're turning to lots of things. They're turning to Islam and they're turning to witch talk and they're turning to New Age and they are turning to ayahuasca and psychedelics and they're turning to church. And so in the midst of a real mess, there is a significant minority of UK people and Australians. I'm from Australia as well. I think in the Anglosphere, there is a significant minority of especially younger people for whom church is back on the table as one of the options. And there are lots of people who are wanting to give it a really serious go.
That's a really great point, and it sets up this next question so very well. So then what do we do? If there's searching, I mean, Speak Life, you've got 321speaklife.org. I mean, a fantastic course that can help us help our people learn to communicate their faith. For those pastors who are listening that are trying to mobilize their church, maybe they're trying to move from invite your friends to church to now talk to your friends about Jesus. What are some ways you're seeing lay people in the pew, so to speak, learning to share about Jesus with those that are searching all around them?
321course.com is this platform that we're sort of developing as it's a one-stop shop for the outsider to come and get a sense of Christianity. It assumes no prior knowledge, and we try and focus on who is Jesus and then his vision for God, the world, and you. And so it's helpful for the non-Christian to get a sense of what Christianity is, but we're also finding that it's really helpful for the Christian to have up their sleeve as a backup. And you can now get into a conversation with your coworker, with your neighbor, with your family member, with your friends. And if it goes well, you've got these resources that you can follow up with. You can send a text message after the conversation if it goes really well, and you can say, why don't you find out more about Jesus at 321course.com? But what we're also finding is that if the conversation goes really badly, it's also a really good follow-up to say, hey, that didn't go the way that I'd planned it to go. But if you go to 321, there's some good stuff. And it doesn't have to be 321course.com. It could be, here's a video by Rebecca McLaughlin, or here's what Sam Albury said about X, Y, or Z, or, and you can send people resources. Nowadays, we have these supercomputers in our pockets. And what we're finding is that doesn't take away from face-to-face evangelism. I think it sort of empowers it and it gives you that safety net so that with abandon, you can launch into a conversation with somebody and you don't have to get it right. You don't have to get it perfect. And they will raise questions that you don't know the answers to, but that's okay. You've got the supercomputer in your pocket and you can text them later. And so I'm just saying to all sorts of just ordinary Christians, everyday Christians in everyday life, there's never been a better time to make a mess of evangelism. So why don't you just raise the topic of the person of Jesus? And so one of the things we encouraging people to do is just scatter various seeds into conversations. Things like, that's what I love about Jesus, ... Finish that sentence. And half the time, your friend will just smile benignly and change the topic of conversation. But a significant amount of the time, they will say, that's interesting. Actually, my grandmother raised me, took me to church, or I had been praying, and this is interesting that I'm having this sort of conversation. And, we teach people all these sorts of seeds that you can sow into conversations. And the goal is not to be polished. Polished seeds are not much use to anybody. The goal is just to stir a conversation that will not go perfectly, but that will begin a relationship. And you've got all sorts of online resources. You've got Sunday morning that you can invite your friends to. But I think in this time of increasing interest in Jesus, we're just encouraging Christians to just take a deep breath, swallow hard, and just sow that first seed. That's what I love about Jesus, or that's what I love about my church, or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, and so many times it's exactly like you said. The way we prepare for that conversation, they might start asking questions you've never even considered, and sometimes we go in trying to answer things they're not asking. I would love to know, as someone is praying about that friend and starting those conversations, what are some of the questions that skeptics, people who are searching, seem to be asking that we need to be more aware of?
Well, I mean, some of the classics are still there, and they're still there for a reason. Suffering is chief among them, because this is a valley of deep shadow, and we all have to walk through it. And issues of apathy towards spirituality, and issues of the felt absence of God. You tell me that there is an all-loving God who is everywhere present. Well, where is he? Not only where was he when we had the miscarriage, but also where is he now if I'm in any way open to him, and he seems to be absent. And I think those questions continue to be the most felt questions that people have. And my advice always with those questions is to make the problem more difficult, because the great problem on a secular worldview is that those problems aren't problems, and they really need to be problems.
Hmm.
It really ought to be a problem that there is evil in this world. It really ought to be a problem that there is pain and suffering. It really ought to be a problem that we feel the absence of God. And my real advice is, in those conversations, invite your friend to have a deeper problem with evil, to have a deeper problem with pain, to have a deeper problem with the hiddenness of God. And the problem that the secular person has is that they don't have a deep enough problem with these things, because if
Hmm.
there is no God, then pain, suffering, and evil, it is what it is. And you have no right to shake your fist at the heavens, because there are no heavens. And so, in all those areas, what I'm basically inviting my non-Christian friend to do is to come on the inside of faith, where those questions can be asked with real seriousness, and where the answers really start to matter. And so, the first move when they raise these kind of issues is to take them more seriously than they take them themselves, rather than, you think you've got a problem with Christianity. That's not a problem. I'll explain to you X, Y, and Z, and you'll see why your problem is not actually a problem. No, no, no. Never do that. If they're raising those sorts of problems, deepen the problem and invite them to truly own that as a problem. But I think you can only really do that on the inside of faith.
Well, and that's where, yes, that's such a great way to then invite them into exploring what Jesus had to say about these very real
Right.
problems. I'd love for you to talk for a moment. I mean, the name of your organization is Speak Life. Your most recent book is How to Speak Life. Why do you think that's such an important way to frame evangelism? I think that's something I'd love for you to share about.
Well, it's a supply side dynamic. It is about us offering Christ. Rather than gaining converts, we don't have it within ourselves to gain converts. God is in the conversion game. We are in the speaking life game. And if we mistake God's role for our role, and we mistake our role for God's role, I think we will either be outrageously proud or probably very depressed when it becomes obvious that we are not God. Our goal is to scatter the seed, and that's the analogy that I use throughout my book called How to Speak Life. It's just the very first parable that Jesus tells, Mark chapter 4, and it's all about this sower of seed who is chucking fistfuls of seed at the most unpromising situations. Like, you would not counsel a farmer to sow on the path or on rocky soil or among thorns. Who sows among thorns, you maniac? What are you even doing? And Jesus is communicating to us that the power is not in the technique of the sower. The power is in the seed itself. And if it only finds good soil, and who knows where the good soil is, that's why you need to scatter it so broadly. If it will only find good soil, it will produce a crop 30, 60, 100 times what is sown. And so the whole dynamic is, it's from the overflow of the heart, it's from the overflow of the church, it's from the overflow of the evangelist that offering words of life happens. And then it's in God the Holy Spirit's gift to bring life from those efforts. And I tell you that absolutely transforms how we think about preaching, how we think of evangelism. I was preaching in this one church for 3 years. I was on staff at this church before I went to seminary. And my final sermon, I was in tears begging people to come to Christ because there were large numbers of the congregation. It was a very evangelistic church. Many people came to that church who were not yet Christians. And I was just begging for them to come to Christ, come to Christ, come to Christ. And at the end, I was slumped in a corner. And a friend of mine was taking around a tray of coffees for people after the service. And he absolutely transformed my mood with just 4 words. It was the most efficient pastoral care I have ever experienced. As he pressed this coffee into my hands, he just said, "You sowed the seed." And then he moved on.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, my shoulders drop, and I'm like, yeah, I sowed the seed. I spoke life.
Yeah.
Job done. Now I can move on. And I tell you, that has a massive impact on just the emotional well-being of the preacher.
Yeah, that's right. I think for pastors, church leaders listening, such a good reminder. We're just supposed to be faithful in what's right in front of us. We don't save anyone. We just introduce people to the one who can in Jesus. You know, one of your books, I think, really helps with that question earlier about, you know, if there is a all-loving God, where is he? The air we breathe. Talk about that book and really kind of the beautiful things that you point out that help us see God is really all around us, and our culture and the things we like about the world in which we live are so influenced by Jesus. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, the air we breathe is kind of an analogy that I use. I grew up in Australia. I've been living in the UK for half my life. But whenever I go back to Australia, I notice how sweetly the air smells because there are so many eucalyptus trees. All the gum trees are just mentholating the air. It's like a cough syrup carried upon the breeze. But I never noticed it. You know, when you live within that atmosphere, that's just air. You don't think it's smelly air. You don't think it's sweet air. It's just air. What I want to do in the air we breathe is take us out of our modern Western sensibilities, our moral intuitions. And first of all, I carry us back to the first century, to the Roman world. They breathed a very different kind of air. They took for granted various moral assumptions that are just appalling to us now. The kind of culture that put Jesus to death on that cross was enforcing Roman glory, Roman might. And that kind of dominance was not just acceptable, it was celebrated. This was entertainment. To put a figure like Jesus to death was to enforce the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. It was to enforce the hierarchy of being in which the gods are at the top and the emperor just beneath them, and the slaves were down at the bottom, and crucifixion was the slave's death, and radical inequality, a real celebration of cruelty and dominance, the assumption of slavery, um, the assumption that we are not individuals who are equal before the law, but we are radically unequal, that by birth we come into a caste system and a vertiginously steep hierarchy of being, and all these kinds of assumptions were just woven into the fabric of that ancient society. And then you think, well, okay, that was that atmosphere. It smells awful to us now. What happened? And the answer is Christianity happened. 20 centuries of Christianization has utterly upended our assumptions. What happened was the figure who was dying on that cross, turns out he was God, which is the most radical upending of everybody's assumptions about what glory is. The Romans thought that glory was the powerful one dominating the weak. Apparently, what Christians are saying is that God, the fittest, was sacrificed for we, the weakest, so that we, the weakest, might survive and thrive and pass on a compassion revolution. That's the utter upending of our natural assumptions. We naturally think that it's survival of the fittest, sacrifice of the weakest. Well, the cross is the sacrifice of the fittest, Jesus Christ, for the survival of the weakest, us. And what it birthed was this compassion revolution in which charities just begin in the way that we understand charities. It was absolutely a novelty in the ancient world. The way we think of hospitals was absolutely a novelty back then. It's now widespread today. Why? Because of the Jesus revolution. They outlawed infanticide. They outlawed child sexual abuse, otherwise known as pederasty. They outlawed the gladiatorial games, and on down through history, you see this compassion revolution. And one of the things that the Air We Breathe is trying to do is trying to say to a modern Westerner, maybe in Austin, Texas, you know those values that you really prize, like compassion and equality and freedom and progress. Those aren't natural. Those aren't obvious. Those aren't universal around the world and down through history. Those aren't self-evident. You didn't get those through some logical deductions. You didn't do a scientific experiment that proved to you human equality. You're a believer. You believe in these things. And I can show you historically, the reason why you believe these things is for some profoundly Jesus-ish reasons. Can we take those things that you believe, pull at the threads of them, and I think we'll find a man on a cross 2,000 years ago who is the absolute epicenter of this earthquake that has rocked your world. And so that's the journey that I'm trying to take people on in The Air We Breathe.
So good. We're going to be giving free copies away of that book as well as How to Speak Life. If you're not already signed up for our email newsletter, do so at innovativechurchleaders.org. I'd love for you to talk one last question. There are maybe a counterfeit version of Christianity, maybe more so in the States than where you are, believes that we're supposed to regain power, kind of take back political power. So they tend to conflate politics and the message of Jesus. What you just described, this Christianization, was the natural, organic movement of God through people. And it was through those people that the laws were changed. The masses demanded, compassion, so to speak. How would you navigate, or how do you recommend pastors and church leaders point towards the kingdom rather than getting stuck in one side or the other of a political solution, which really is not the answer?
Well, what is politics? It's taken from the Greek word polis. And I think Augustine was so wise to talk about, well, there are two cities you could be interested in. There's the city of man and there's the city of God. And the city of man is bound upon the secular. The secular is a Latin word that just means for the next 100 years, for the sort of the span of this human duration. And Augustine's great critique of Rome was that it was consumed with the glory of man. It was consumed with pride, and it fell under its own sort of force of gravity. That kind of, the sense of pride is constantly dragging down, 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 down. And really, from Augustine onwards, what you see is the knitting together of a Christendom that had a vision of the city of God, whose expression is the church of Jesus Christ. And this is the realm of the eternal, not the realm of the time bound. This is the realm in which humility and sacrifice is glorious rather than the pride and dominance of the city of man. This city of God vision captivated what had been smashed to bits when the western half of the Roman Empire was. That did lead to all sorts of political settlements and the development of things like parliaments. And aren't we glad of that? The development of a language around human rights. And aren't we glad of that? The development of understandings of just war. And aren't we glad of that? And it is true that down through history, it hasn't only been the activity of the church that has changed things. You could think about the abolitionist movement in Britain. It was begun by Quakers and evangelicals preaching the scriptures. It was helped by legislation in Parliament to actually abolish the transatlantic slave trade, and it was helped by the fact that the British Navy was able to patrol the waters. That kind of political force did help, but when you point to examples of progress in these sorts of ways, it was always preceded by the martyrdom, the witness, the spiritual persuasion of preachers and charities. It was always, first of all, the people of God by the word of God, forwarding the ends of God via the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, rather than the sword of steel, which is either violence in the scriptures or the sword that you could trust to is the sword of state power, Romans 13. And so I think a little bit of church history would make us realize that laws do teach that there is a place for the city of man, but that over and above all the developments of the city of man, it is the city of God which operates according to the sword of the Spirit that has actually been the great driver of change down through the centuries. So I would always want to lean into that.
So well said. Thank you so much, Glenn. We really appreciate your resources, your YouTube channel, the books, the courses. Thanks for helping speak life into our world.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Innovative Church Leaders Podcast. Be sure to subscribe and share as we bring spirit-led innovation, reach new people, and make disciples who make disciples. Be sure to sign up for our email newsletter at innovativechurchleaders.org for free resources and an opportunity to join a cohort with Dr. N.T. Wright.